And so we come to the moment that I've kind of been building up to through this series of lectures, giving you kind of background to medieval Scandinavia, to Icelandic literature itself. And what I'd like to do is just kind of give you a brief, not so much overview as glance really, of the range of genres and the kinds of writing that Icelanders get up to. And it's of course worth being explicit about the fact that I'm not kind of keen on medieval Icelandic literature because of some kind of particular passion for Iceland, though Iceland's a top place and everything. And also modern Icelandic is virtually the same as Old Icelandic, which is just deeply cool and means that you can read Old Icelandic more or less as if it were a living language, which is just fantastic. But the key thing is that it's the Icelanders who write stuff down. You get a little bit of narrative writing in Norway and Denmark, to a much lesser extent Sweden, in the sort of 12th, 13th centuries. Sweden kind of picks up the 14th and 15th a bit, but even then there's not a huge amount. Norwegians and Danes, when they get started, tend to be writing in Latin, which is totally fair enough. But nonetheless brings us less closely in contact with the kind of vernacular culture of those regions. But the Icelanders, from the time of Arion Frode and his Icelandic book, which I mentioned in the last video, really get into writing narrative prose. And we'll talk a little bit, or I'll talk a little bit, about the reasons for that just at the end of the lecture, insofar as we know any of the reasons. But that's why we get this focus on Icelandic literature. And well, let's just have a look at the kind of genres of saga writing that you get first. Sagas, within the world of kind of literary criticism of medieval Icelandic literature, are by definition prose narratives, so they may include poetry being quoted. So yes, a poem like Beowulf, which is an Old English poem, wouldn't count as a saga because it's in verse. But Icelanders really get into prose writing in ways that are quite sort of surprising, really, in some respects, because poetry is usually the main vehicle for vernacular writing in medieval Europe. In any case, let's have a look at some of the genres that Icelanders get up to writing. All right, let's look at this first. I've covered most of this already, but yes, sagas, usually anonymous, which is pretty important, really. It's very hard for us to know where a saga was written, when, who was writing it. We get very little of that evidence, and we have to kind of work it out from little hints. And a very different attitude to authorship and authority from what we're used to in our kind of post-Renaissance, classicised world of literacy. They're in prose, as I've said, and they tend to be recomposed as they get copied by scribes. Needless to say, we're in a pre-print culture, so people, if you want to copy a text, you actually have to get out your pen, or get someone else to get out their pen and copy it. These texts would very often have been read out to illiterate people, so the audience for text could be much wider than the literate people sort of in the community where that text existed. But texts would be copied, and as people copied them, they did tend to rewrite them. They might change the spelling or the dialect just to kind of make it suit their own language better, or their own kind of customs, spelling norms. But they could also kind of take chunks out, put chunks in, reword chunks, a really common process. So we often have several manuscripts of a saga which will have quite different versions, sometimes profoundly different versions, sometimes just tweaked at the edges. But you get all of this kind of variety in our manuscript tradition. And that tends to get kind of rather brutally, ironed out, steamrolled out by editors and translators who will kind of give you just one text. So that's something to be aware of. Okay, but that's the general kind of literacy context that we're dealing with then with these sagas. And I should emphasise again that these are being written from about the 13th century onwards, but they're very often set in the 10th, even the 9th century. And it's really important to have that in your head. If they're writing about the 10th century, they're not eyewitness accounts at all, even if they seem incredibly plausible. They're written centuries later, maybe based on oral traditions coming from those times, maybe the hallucinations of kind of mad Icelanders with nothing to do in the winter. Very hard to tell. All right, cool. So here's a list of genres, and these genres are modern classifications, which is why I've got modern spelling for them. So we've got Sögur here with an O with an umlaut, which is a modern Icelandic spelling of what in Old Icelandic is written as an O with a hook under it. So these are modern genres, but they do work reasonably well. Some of our medieval manuscripts group sagas in ways that fit with these classifications. Admittedly, some don't. The most famous genre by far, or group by far, is the Icelandic Sögur, the sagas of Icelanders, or sagas about Icelanders. They're largely set on Iceland. The narrative usually runs from the settlement of Iceland, or somewhat before, to the conversion to Christianity. So circa 874 to 1000, give or take a couple of generations on either side. They quote verse, and we'll come on to verse in due course, or several of them quote verse. Among these sagas are Fólkabræðra saga, which seems to have been written early, though, as so often, our manuscripts don't survive from before the 14th century, but it might have been written in the early 13th. Another example would be Laxdæla saga, written later in the 13th century. So these have become the kind of classic canonical sagas, most often translated, most often read, often appreciated for their fine literary values. Sparse style, sort of, what's that word? Not taciturn, but characters who don't say much but do a lot with the words that they say. There's probably a word for that anyway. Stoic characters as well. Exciting and interesting portrayals of women, all sorts of interesting stuff going on in those sagas. They've become really dominant in how Icelandic literature gets read, both by Icelanders and by the rest of the world. And it's understandable, they're great texts, but there are a lot of other genres too, and they have their own kind of interest and merits. The next on my list are the Fotnaldar the sagas, or in this case it's a singular, the saga, of an ancient epoch, old in the nominative, aldar in the genitive, ancient epochs sagas. These are set usually before the conversion to Christianity, or at least before the conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity, and they are set not on Iceland but on the continent, whether mainland Scandinavia or Europe or both, or indeed the Near East or India. And these have been considered less good literature generally in the history of the study of Old Icelandic or Old Norse literature, but they have an awful lot to offer, and scholars are increasingly looking at them. Partly, I guess, because they've just kind of burnt out on the Icelandic Sögur, but also because they're starting to appreciate the diversity of medieval Scandinavian literature and the different things that different genres offer. But heroic deeds of daring do set in the distant heathen past. It's very interesting that Icelanders would want to write about that past and write about their kind of pre-settlement past. Examples: Völsunga saga, very famous, one of the sources and inspirations for Wagner's operas, but a work of interest in its own right too, fortunately. And Heiðrek saga, again, looks likely to be an early 13th century piece of work, so relatively early Icelandic prose narrative, and both of those quote substantial chunks of verse, which again I'll talk about at the end of the video. Next on the list we have Riddarasögur, sagas of riders, etymologically, but knights. Riddari is Old Icelandic word for a knight. And these overlap in lots of ways with the Fotnaldar really, and it can be quite hard to kind of make hard and fast distinctions between those genres. But they tend to be modelled on high medieval European romance, knights going about in armour with castles, things that really weren't seen at all on Iceland itself. A lot of them are translated from things like French romances or even Latin. That becomes a very major genre, but the translated works do give rise to a whole genre of native romances, as they might be called, or sort of local Icelandic romance composition too. Often set outside Scandinavia, that would be one way of kind of marking them off from Fotnaldar Sögur. And also in terms of the kind of content and style, they often have quite different themes. Riddarasögur are much concerned with love and marriage in ways that Fornaldarsögur often are not, but I wouldn't want to overstate the distinctions. And Riddarasögur have been even less read than either of the genres aforementioned. I guess the ones that have been translated, people are less interested in because they're not kind of specifically Scandinavian productions. Might as well go and read them in French. But of course, what Scandinavians do to them in terms in translating them, how they tweak them, how they kind of adapt them to their own culture, is a very, very interesting process. Even less attention has been paid to the sort of local romances. They've tend to have very, very fairy tale type narratives, very kind of stock plots and stock characters and stock motifs for that matter. And so they've been looked down on as very poor literature. And I mean, Icelanders have really been quite embarrassed about them and sort of set them against these wonderful Icelandic that are so distinctive and remarkable. And you can see where they're coming from, but nonetheless, there's a lot of interesting and weird stuff to be found in Riddarasögur. And because it's, of course, a field that hardly anyone has studied, it's attracting new attention now as people start to go, well, actually, let's think about this kind of wider literary context for these Icelandic sögur. And characteristically of these things, Riddarasögur often survive in a lot more manuscripts than sagas that are now considered canonical literary texts. So that's a kind of warning shot as well. It reminds us that probably most people were listening to these stories a lot more than they were listening to the ones that are most often read now. Okay, bit further down the list we have Samtíðarsögur, literally same times, genitive plural, saga. Saga of current times, sagas of the present. And these are basically kind of chronicle type accounts. They don't tend to sort of list years in the margin, but they're sort of blow-by-blow accounts of what's happening on Iceland. By far the most prominent is Sturlunga saga, which gets kind of adapted in various ways, but is the story of the Sturlungar, a kind of clan of politicians. And they weren't necessarily written year by year in the way that a chronicle would be, but they sort of match that genre of medieval writing. Written by contemporaries or near contemporaries of the people involved. They tend to be a lot more brutal than Icelandic sögur, in the sense that in an Icelandic saga you'll just sort of hew at someone with an axe and their head will come straight off and no one will think twice about it. Whereas in a Samtíðarsögur saga, you'll kind of have to chop away for hours at the neck before the head will actually come off. Essentially they're much more realistic. Much less read. That kind of real lifiness gives them a very kind of lurching, slow kind of structure. Unlike the kind of carefully sculpted, kind of neatly formed forms of the Icelandic sögur. But again, they have their merits, and they have distinctive literary merits of their own as well, which can be pursued and studied. Not too much more on my list. We've got Konungasögur, sagas about kings. This is a genre that goes back an awfully long way, and in some ways is a founding genre for medieval Icelandic literature. Because stories about kings, well, kings are very high status members of society. Some of them are saints, like Olafur Haraldsson, King of Norway, Olaf II, who dies at a battle against the Danes, who are also Christians, but he gets held up as a martyr and he becomes a saint. So you get sort of saints' lives coming into Scandinavia as a very kind of characteristic medieval European and Christian genre. And those can get applied to kings quite easily, and that provides a straightforward basis for early Icelandic writers to start developing genres written in their own language, narratives written in their own language about kings, and then they can kind of start to move out to other subjects. So Konungasögur are quite important in terms of the literary history of Iceland, because they provide a bridge between Latin, European, Christian writing about saints to writing about Scandinavian subjects who may be saints but may also have secular kind of authority and secular roles. Lots of skaldic verses there too. We'll come on to those in a minute. And finally, Biskupasögur, sagas about bishops. I can't be bothered to spout anything about sagas about bishops. They're about bishops. They're a bit like Samtíðarsaga a lot of the time. Groovy. So that's hopefully given you a rough sense of the kind of range of different kinds of prose writing that medieval, or narrative prose writing that medieval Icelanders get involved in. They have other kinds of prose writing too, but these are the more kind of prominent and famous examples. So I've given you hopefully a reasonably clear framework for thinking about the kind of literature that medieval Icelanders are writing. Let's just mess with your head a little bit by thinking not about genre, but about mode, which is a concept that a literary critic called Northrop Frye was very keen on. Probably other people have talked about it too. Genre is quite a tricky concept, really. It can be quite hard to sort of pigeonhole texts into any one genre. In fact, it's probably fundamentally impossible to pigeonhole any text fundamentally into one genre. It's a useful concept for us to think with, and it can help us to understand how different writers are kind of getting models and ideas for their narratives. But at the same time, it's a very blurry, fuzzy set. You can have texts that you might sort of see as prototypical examples of particular genres. A saint's life that is the most saint's lifey of all saints' lives. But there'll be lots of other ones that are much more blurry at the edge. A saint's life that's about a king who's not really a great saint, he kills a lot of people. That's starting to look a little bit more like a Konunga saga, and so forth. So Northrop Frye had this concept of the mode, and that's quite a useful way of thinking about things. We might think about sagas having, for example, an Icelandic saga mode and a Fotnaldar saga mode. So when things are set on Iceland, you kind of switch over to your Icelandic saga mode, and the ways of writing, the kinds of events that can happen in your plot, the kind of characters you meet, the kinds of ways they talk, can be the sort of thing that you'd expect in an Icelandic saga, and then they can go abroad, and with that move, they can kind of move into the world of the Fotnaldarsaga or the Riddarasögur, and the kinds of things that would happen to you in one of those sagas can happen to you. So a saga can move between modes, or kind of mix modes, within one composition. As a rule of thumb, as I say on this slide, the further events are in time and or space from the saga's author or audience, the more likely strange or supernatural events are. That's a really kind of prominent feature of saga writing. Things get more and more outlandish the further away you go. The implication seems to be that outlandish things are more plausible when they're far away, and that's definitely kind of true of how people think in my society. People will believe things about different ethnic groups that they would never believe about their own ethnic groups, and they'll believe things about behaviour of people in different countries that they would never believe about the behaviour of people in their own country, even though objectively you'd be able to kind of find evidence that really these people behave quite similarly in those respects. So medieval Icelanders have kind of quite similar issues going on. Fine, well that's a very quick tour of what's going on with medieval Icelandic prose writing, and I don't want to kind of overdo it. Let's just skip on to verse to finish. There we go. There are two main forms of poetry in medieval Icelandic literature, the names of which are applied by modern scholars and are really, in their ways, quite unhelpful. We have the form Idaic verse and also the form Skaldic verse. Now these terms, like I say, are quite unhelpful, and they're sort of a historical accident, really. There's a guy called Snorri Sturluson, who is an Icelander, who wrote a prose work, a mythography, which he called his Edda. And it sort of described, from Snorri's Christian 13th century perspective, the traditional beliefs of Iceland, medieval Scandinavia more generally. Talked about pagan gods and so forth. And for Snorri, of course, they were pagan gods because he had a concept of pagans because he was a Christian. Pagans didn't necessarily have that concept, however. So Snorri writes this book that he calls his Edda. And the word Edda only occurs twice in Old Icelandic, and that's one of the occasions. It doesn't help us very much. On the other occasion, it seems to be a word meaning great-grandmother. It occurs in a poem. So maybe that's what Snorri meant his Edda to be, his kind of great-grandmother, the old woman who tells you folk stories by the fireside when you're a kid or something. And then scholars kind of found this manuscript, known colloquially as the Codex Regius, the royal book, because it was owned by the King of Denmark. It was originally written on Iceland, but it wound up being owned by the King of Denmark. That's the library class mark. I don't think I'll attempt to read it out. My Danish pronunciation's even worse than my Norwegian. Yes, I won't go into detail on that. Anyway, you've got this manuscript from around the 1270s, and it's packed with poems of a particular poetic form and a particular set of genres. And I won't go into detail about poetic form, but it's relatively simple form that these poems are written in. And they're narrative poems, and the narratives are about gods and or about heroes. So they're narrative poems on these mythological and legendary themes that overlap in content a lot with what goes on in the Fotnaldar Sögur. And a lot of them get quoted in Fotnaldar Sögur. And so scholars sort of in the 18th century or whatever it was kind of went, oh wow, this is like a poetic Edda. Snorri's one's in prose, and they're like, well, this is an Edda too, clearly, without really knowing what the word Edda meant, which is a bit silly, but we've now got this term Eddaic poetry and we're stuck with it. And we think about the Codex Regius often as being the poetic Edda, but there are other manuscripts containing other Eddaic poems. Okay, so you've got your Eddaic verse, narrative, heroic, mythological poems in relatively simple poetic forms, which overlap with the Fotnaldar Sögur. Then you get your skaldic verse, and skaldic is yet another silly term in the sense that the Old Icelandic word skald means a poet. And so it's like saying poetic verse, and it's like, well, hang on, why is it Eddaic verse, poetic verse? That's composed by skalds as well. It's called in modern English skald, by the way, which is a Norse loan. If someone's a skald, they kind of diss people, and it seems that skalds dissed people in medieval Iceland too, amongst other things. But there we go, we're stuck with the terminology, skaldic verse, and this kind of set of poetry is usually praise poetry or occasional verse of considerable or incredible complexity. These tend to be short poems. Well, I say that, it's not necessarily true. They're stanzaic poems anyway, these little stanzas. And the metrical forms they entail have incredible patterns of rhyme and alliteration and syllable counts. And they're really hard to compose. And all sorts of kind of syntactic acrobatics have to go on to make these poems work. So they're also very hard to read. These poems were composed in praise of kings. You could kind of compose someone a praise poem, and it'd be a bit like being someone's marketing manager, really. And they would kind of pay you a load of money for the service, just like you pay someone for running an advertising campaign or something like that. So skaldic verse is used for praise, and it seems that the complexity of the form is part of that whole process of praising. You're kind of saying, hey, I've put in so much effort to create this incredibly complex verse. The guy I'm praising is worth all this effort. And it's sort of there's a connoisseurship element to it as well. You know, if a king can actually understand the damn thing, then he gets prestige. This stuff was sometimes hard for medieval people to understand. But skaldic verse does get used for a very, very wide range of themes beyond that. I've talked about scolds and scolding, and you can use skaldic verse to diss people. We have an awful lot of occasional poetry where people just come out with these verses on the spot, whether or not they did in real life. Well, I'm sure sometimes people did. Whether all the verses that are claimed to be kind of occasional verses for characters in sagas were composed by those people in those circumstances is another question. But yeah, you know, someone chops your arm off and you come out with a pithy skaldic verse to diss them about it. And the genre also gets used for religious poetry later on, praising God, talking about Mary. Sometimes it does actually get into narrative forms in later periods, and it tends to have much less complex forms in those circumstances. But here we are, we've got our skaldic verse, usually praise poetry or occasional verse. And rather than being found in a big book like the Codex Regius, it's mainly found quoted in sagas. Apart from the religious stuff, that does actually kind of wind up in its own manuscript. But the secular stuff is found quoted in Icelandic and Konungasögur, sagas about Icelanders and sagas about kings, and some other genres, but the Icelandic and the Konungasögur are the really prominent places where you'd find skaldic verse. Okay, so there we are. That's just a rough picture of the kinds of literature, the kinds of texts that medieval Icelanders are producing from about the 13th century onwards. Why the Icelanders and no one else? Well, answering that is always going to be really complex and ultimately perhaps impossible. We'll never fully sort it out, as if that sort of problem ever could be fully sorted out. But I think it's worth kind of pausing to think about the fact that Iceland's a very small community, and it's a small colony for that matter. So you get this bunch of people who are kind of plucked out of mainland Scandinavia and dumped on this rock, or dumped themselves on the rock, and that provokes a very conservative culture because you've got a fairly small number of people, not too much kind of communication with wider culture. That promotes linguistic conservatism for sure. I mean, Icelandic changes much less quickly than mainland Scandinavian languages. Fewer people are producing variants, and therefore fewer variants are going to get adopted into the system. And it produces perhaps cultural conservatism as well. And certainly in the 13th century, early 13th century, a Dane, Saxo Grammaticus, who wanted to write a history of Denmark, was going to Icelanders for a lot of his sources, or source material, because in their culture they had kind of preserved this material, whereas his, according to Saxo, to some extent hadn't. So there's an element of just the Icelanders wrote this stuff down because they could and no one else could. But I think, that's a kind of sufficient. I mean, it's a necessary cause for Icelanders to write some of this literature, but it's not a sufficient cause. There must be other factors too. And I guess perhaps the main one that's at the top of my mind, though it surely wouldn't be the only one, is an amazing self-consciousness about these people who are sitting on a rock. They're conscious that they've only just arrived there, they're new settlers, so they've got a sense of wanting to explain where they came from. Why don't they have a king before the 1260s? Everyone else seems to have a king, why don't they have a king? So they feel kind of weird and different. They know they converted much later than much of Europe, and the fact that their culture was very recently pagan is still echoing for them. I guess a lot of them are still wondering, well, did my dad or granddad or whoever, great-granddad, get to go to heaven? Is he just damned because he was a pagan? Maybe. So they're worried about these issues, and they want to talk about why they're there, how they settled the place, want to talk about their conversion to Christianity, but also their pre-Christian past. And as Icelandic independence is eroded, as they become part of Norway, as the power of Icelanders is snatched increasingly from their hands, they're perhaps also wanting to kind of say, and we are special, and we have an identity, and we have great heroes, and we have had great heroes. And that's that use of literacy to kind of promote, national identity, you might think of it as, or at least kind of cultural, ethnic identity, seems to be a very important part of why medieval Icelanders write so much. While everyone else in Scandinavia is just sitting around going, well, I'm a Norwegian. I know I'm a Norwegian. I know why I'm here. I've been here forever. Maybe that's part of the picture. Okay, I won't go on any longer. Good luck exploring medieval Scandinavian literature, most of which will be Icelandic, but some of which won't be. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you have found this a kind of reasonably useful scene setting for what's going on in medieval Scandinavia, why people are writing, what they're writing about, and how the time in which they're writing is very different from the time about which they're writing a lot of the time. Okay, thanks very much for listening, assuming you did. Okay, I'm all ready to switch it off now, so I'll give you a wave, and best of luck, enjoy yourself.